Hello. Today we're talking about painting and sculpture, quilts and prints, collage and brushwork, artists Tschabalala Self and Faith Ringgold. Welcome to BMA NMWA, the monthly talk show that always highlights the work of women artists. Today's episode is In Relation.
And relation is our key word today as we explore art by Tschabalala Self with the artist herself, looking at paintings as both a single work on canvas and also a piece that exists within a network of relationships. I'm Addie Gayoso from the National Museum of Women in the Arts.
And I'm Veronica Betancourt from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And as always, we're extremely live and excited to welcome artist Tschabalala Self, who has an upcoming exhibition titled Tschabalala Self by myself that opens March 28th at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Shaba is an artist who brings a wide range of media to her paintings. She also creates sculptures and installations and builds a relationship between her work, art history, and the world around her. Thank you so much for joining us, Shaba.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's great. So I thought we might start by talking a little bit about kind of the play on words that's in the upcoming exhibition title for your show, Tschabalala Self by myself, because though it is by you, one of the things that you're frequently exploring in your work is the relationship between people and how more often than not, no one is ever truly by themselves, but is existing in a relationship to others or in relationship to a larger history. So I thought we could start by kind of exploring that idea with this painting called Loner, where at first glance it seems like it's a well-defined figure with an almost equally weighty, what looks to me like an orange shadow, maybe. And that, for me, reads almost like a space of contemplation for considering the weight or the presence of the figure in the room. So I'm curious, kind of what sort of emotional or psychological space were you hoping to create in this painting?
Well, the title of this painting is Loner, and as you described, it shows a figure alone. The only companion that they have in this piece is their own shadow. So it is about isolation, or I guess solitude is a better word. And also how even within solitude, there's multiple selves. So her companion in the work is herself, or an aspect of herself that there's potentially, I guess I'm applying, there's a level of dissonance between. So that's kind of what some of the thinking in the work. And then pictorially, the pattern in the lower half of the painting is meant to mimic like a textile one would encounter in a domestic space. So thinking like a bedspread or a couch, a curtain. So in my mind, the figure was within the home, and the wash behind the figure and her shadow self, as you pointed out, is meant to refer to maybe a psychological or emotional space, but to also give some kind of pictorial depth to create an environment around the figure. Opposed to some of my other works, when the figures are against a color field, which is meant to be more of like a nowhere space, a liminal space. Figure is meant to be anchored in an actual environment.
I really appreciate that you're sort of helping us understand the sort of setting or space of this figure, and particularly interested in sort of the domestic patterning that you're sort of implying here. And I'm noticing that, this grid pattern you've talked about during our initial conversation, that some of your favorite patterns and fabrics sort of repeat themselves across works. And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about sort of the practical reasons for that, as well as the aesthetic reasons.
Yeah, one of the reasons that happens is because I collect lots of fabrics and they all exist in my studio. So I'm constantly pulling from the same bins or collections of fabrics and making new works. So basically, if I was to purchase or to acquire like a 1 yard or several yards of one kind of material, because of the nature of the collage and the assemblage, that material would maybe last me for years. So during that time, it can manage its way into like multiple different pieces. That's kind of more the practical end as to why that happens. But conceptually, I think that I'm drawn to certain materials because of their color, their design, and their texture, because I'm associating or I'm imbuing them with certain kind of like affect. So I would say that this material would be for a joyous figure. This material would maybe refer to some kind of like melancholy or any gamut of emotions or ideas. So it does often happen that, or in another instance, a certain material I think can really articulate a certain part of the body. So often pulling from the same material to kind of perform the same gesture from work to work. And that accounts for the reoccurrence or the abundance of one material over the other.
That's so interesting to think about the fabric kind of, or a particular material tied with a specific part of the body, and also maybe with like different ideas of the motion or the expression of that part of the human form. And, you know, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about kind of the profusion of material that you have in this painting. I know that our conservation department at the Baltimore Museum of Art had a really fun time talking with you about everything that you use and sort of building out the label copy. I mean, in this one alone, I think we've got fabric, burlap, upholstery fabric, faux fur, thread, flash, which is a vinyl-based paint that creates a sort of opaque velvety finish, and acrylic paint, all on canvas. So that abundance, as you put it, to me really kind of shows the influence of Faith Ringgold in a way. I know that you've mentioned her, as well as the vibrant pattern collages of Romare Bearden as being influences for you. And I'd kind of be curious to hear more about how this combination of material and also this expansion of painting, of kind of layering of materials and layering of paint is all kind of related to the quilts and the collage and just sort of making a lot into one work.
Yeah, I've definitely always been inspired by quilt making. It's like the aesthetic qualities of quilt making. So you have the ability to use multiple different materials. You have the ability to use materials from your life, materials that you purchase. You're able to kind of play not just with changing the palette, but also texture and feel and association, because you're using objects that are already of the world. And those objects, the audience or whoever's engaging with your art object, they already have their own associations attached to each one of those kinds of materials or fabrics. So you're able to kind of pull on the collective memory that's associated with all those different things. So for all those different reasons, I've always found quilt making interesting. And as art objects, I've always found them very fascinating. Similarly, I'm interested in collage for the same reason. A lot of collage, especially early collage, was oftentimes taken from magazines or other kind of debris from like popular culture. So you're able to kind of pull and source things of the world and bring all those narratives like into your own discrete object or object piece, whatever. So on the conceptual end, those are some of my interests. But then I think as a maker, I just lean more towards, I'm just more inclined to work with many materials and to build. Before I found this aesthetic language, I did a lot of printmaking, and the way in which I approached printmaking was through collagraphs, and that's also another building process. So I think it's just partially my inclination to work in this way. Now I also have like an interest in sculpture, and the way I've been approaching sculpture is again through accumulation. Artists that I think about as well, like outside of Romare Bearden and Faith Ringgold. Another artist I think about often is Nora Purfoy, who's an ensemble. So I think that it's a combination of my own tastes, my own interests, and then me just through experimentation, trying to collapse all those various aspects of my practice, I landed on this way of kind of communicating my ideas.
I love this idea of materials having their own stories and their collective memory, and being kind of layered in and pieced together, and the deliberate choice to use things that have already had their own lives and already have their own associations as part of your paintings. And Addie, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Faith Ringgold as we pull up one of her story quilts.
Absolutely. So I think many people who are watching maybe have heard of Faith Ringgold, and certainly she is probably best known for her story quilts, and this is an example of one we'll talk about in a little bit, as well as her children's books. But I want to tell you a little bit more about her biography just to sort of place her. She was born in 1930 in Harlem, towards the end of the Harlem Renaissance. And her community was extremely vibrant in terms of creativity. Her neighbors included musician and DC native Duke Ellington, artists Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, and poet Langston Hughes. Ringgold's mother was a fashion designer, and her father was an avid storyteller. And so this all comes into play, I think, as we see her works, especially her mature works like these story quilts. From early on, she was really interested in becoming an artist, and she was destined to sort of tell these really compelling and deeply personal stories. Her works center on the Black, and often specifically the Black female experience. And I want to point out, especially since it's Women's History Month, that she really wanted to study art at City College of New York, but at the time, women were not permitted to enter the art program. So she sort of backdoored it and studied art education instead. And she also became a public school teacher over time, as well as she developed her painting career. And as we get to this point in her career, when she started making these quilts, just a little bit of background. In the 1970s, she took a trip throughout Europe and saw Tonka paintings from Nepal, specifically from the 14th and 15th centuries, and was really inspired by the stories they told of Buddhist deities and scenes, and inspired a lot of her works moving forward. So I would say she was combining these painting techniques that she explored in her early works, the sewing skills that she was taught by her mother, and then the storytelling techniques of her father to create these beautiful story quilts. This is an example of a story quilt in our collection, and it's called Jo Baker's Bananas. It's part of her American collection series. And I'm just curious, Shaba, what your responses or what strikes you about this particular quilt?
Some of the things that strike me about this piece are the movement of the central figures. Also, I'm wondering too, I'm aware that they're different figures, but it's also seen as if they're mirrors of one another. So I think that's also interesting in regard to a conversation about sameness and difference. I'm also intrigued by kind of the illogical organization of the picture plane. So it's not a traditional way to describe foreground and background. That's something that I often do as well in my work. It's somewhat like a flattening of the pictorial space, which allows the work to kind of veer in some instances into abstraction.
Yeah.
And this kind of use of abstraction, I think, allows also for there to be conceptually like a intersection between like the quotidian and fantastical. And one of my favorite works by Faith Ringgold that I've kind of followed me throughout my whole life is Tar Beach, which is actually a children's book. It's a children's book based on a individual quilt, but that work shows kind of like has like a primary figure. The protagonist is a young girl named Casey, and throughout the story she can fly, and that again I think shows kind of this conflation between like the real and the imagined. And I also can identify with that kind of desire to bring fantasy into the quotidian, especially in regard to conversations around Black life.
I love this flattening of space that you talk about, the idea of it being sort of liminal or sort of fantastical in a way and realistic in another. It actually makes me think a little bit of the work of Delita Martin as well, who's really interested in creating this sort of layered space that's meant to be sort of between the real life, sort of physical life and spiritual life. And I think I just wanted to mention, it's important to note about this particular work that this central figure is Jo Baker, Josephine Baker, who is a well-known African-American performer, but she really sort of abandoned the United States because of racism in the country, and really sort of adopted France as her home. And she was well known not only for her for being in, she was the first African American and first Black woman in a silent film. She was very well known for performing at major clubs in Europe, like the Folies Bergère. And this particular image actually sort of depicts her in multiple moments, right? Almost like this very traditional sort of continuous narrative, which suggests this dance that she did in her famous banana skirt. So I just wanted to point out a little bit more about the subject itself of this work, and that she was also an activist, Jo Baker, as is Faith Ringgold, really. So just a little bit more context about this particular piece.
And I'd like to kind of pick that thread, the compositional thread, up again, because Shah, you started up by saying that it doesn't have a traditional foreground or background, and that abstraction really creates a sort of flattening. And as I'm thinking about it in relationship to your work and the way that you described the sort of blank color backgrounds as a nowhere space, I'm thinking about the way that the sort of figurative in an abstract space is almost like, is it functioning as a means of kind of highlighting the emotional, highlighting the subjectivity and the psychological, so that viewers can have that like emotional connection to, I'm a person who is in the presence of a person's representation, but then sort of allowing the space for analysis and kind of reflection around it. Is that kind of part of what stripping the landscape or sort of flattening interiors is doing?
I think that it allows for the potential for that conversation, whereas maybe if you have a figure that's grounded in a realistic space, all of the social and political conversations that are generally associated with that space are then automatically brought to the foreground of the work. Mm-hmm. And you can no longer see the individual depicted as maybe one person. They become part of a larger system, the system that they're rendered within. Having a figure be in a non-identifiable locale, you don't really know how to place them you don't know how to place them socially. And I think that allows for more potential to have conversations about the existential or the kind of the psychological, the emotional. So that's kind of my take on it. But I think a lot of artists have lots of different opinions about that. So.
Yes, I think lots of artists have lots of different opinions is sort of like a blanket statement for the world. Definitely. Yeah. So I guess kind of on the thinking, like sort of continuing to think about social and political representation, I wanted to bring up a quote from Faith Ringgold that appeared in the January 1973 issue of Ms. Magazine, where she's talking about kind of her decision to become an artist. And she says, quote, "After I decided to be an artist, the first thing that I had to believe was that I, a Black woman, could penetrate the art scene, and that further, I could do so without sacrificing one iota of my Blackness or my femaleness or my humanity." And that's the quote. And I bring it up because I think it really conveys sort of the vigor and the urgency of self-determination and of making space. And I wanted to connect that to another work by Ringgold, Matisse's Model, the French Collection, Part 1, Number 5. And this is a story quilt from 1991 that's in the Baltimore Museum of Art collection. And this is part of a series of works where Ringgold is telling a story of a fictional Black artist and artist model in 1920s Paris, and sort of presenting a different view, a revisionist view of kind of what the School of Paris and the art scene in Paris was like in the early 20th century, as seen kind of through Ringgold's protagonists. So I wanted to kind of take a minute to start thinking about how Ringgold is considering Matisse. I mean, here the first thing that stands out to me is that the piece is titled Matisse's Model. And so even though she's unnamed, she's still kind of the central subject of this quilt. She's staring right back out at the viewer. And she's really taking up space alongside the portrait of artist Henri Matisse in the lower right-hand corner. So, Shaba, I know that you spent some time reconsidering and reimagining and responding to Matisse. And so kind of in light of that consideration and also your connection to Ringgold, I'd be curious to hear, what do you see when you look at this particular work?
When I look at this work, I definitely see Ringgold's attempt to unpack, I guess, the legacy of Matisse and also maybe the reality versus the myth.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at this work, especially, also like in relation to like Denise Morel's research, you know that there were lots of models that Matisse had that were from the Caribbean or from like the colonized parts of Africa that France was in communication with. People had immigrated there from those regions. So, but it's not something that is readily accessible if you are kind of exploring art history. It's not something that's spoken about often. So I think that she's trying to maybe address the erasure of the Black women who served as muses for Matisse. That's the first thing that occurs to me when looking at this. Also, I feel like she's paying homage to Matisse, some of his pattern making in his paintings, playing with that with direct painting, and also relating that to some of her collage, some of the gestures in her work that are more heavily related to collage.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like this work is affectionate, but also critical. And I feel like one emotion is not really outweighing the other. But it seems like an attempt to not rewrite history, but make a buried history known.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do love how you sort of laid out the many different elements that we see in this story quilt. And I'd be curious to hear a little more about maybe sort of, you mentioned the myth as opposed to the history. And is that something, that idea of like the kind of the grandiose myth, something that was in your mind as you visited the BMA and saw the many, many Matisses that we have on view, and sort of what was feeding into your response to that part of the collection?
As an artist and painter, I admire Matisse's work a lot. So for me, it was interesting to kind of explore the archive and to learn more about the work. See a lot of these works that I have seen my whole life in publications or reproductions, to see them in person. I really appreciated that aspect of it. And to see so much of the work in one place, so I can kind of really see them in relation to one another. As I kind of left the museum and I was doing more research on my own to get more inspiration as to what works I wanted to make in response to the collection, that's when I was finding more things out that I thought were interesting that I was surprised I had never learned about after high school, undergrad, and graduate school research in art. Not really knowing about the diversity that existed within his studio and his milieu of artists and intellectuals that were around at that time. Those are two things that stood out to me the most.
Thank you. Yeah. For those of you who haven't been to the Baltimore Museum of Art, this is an image of our cone wing. And I pulled it up because you can kind of see one of the sculptures that served as initial point for your development of the two women paintings. And it's Two Women by Henri Matisse. And unfortunately, for image rights reasons, we don't have a closer view of this, but if you can come to the BMA, you can see it close up. But I think to know that it's kind of a sculpture of two women sort of somewhat overlapped with each other, and I'm trying to like make a sculpture with my hands here, one facing forward and one facing back as the relationship. I'd love to kind of move the conversation from how you kind of took your research on Matisse into the creation of Two Women, and kind of framed the relationship in your own terms. There we go.
Great.
So this is the first take on the piece. As you described in the original work, there's one figure facing towards the back and one facing outwards. The sculpture is based actually on like ethno-erotic photograph that would have been in, I guess, a magazine that was these kinds of magazines that were, I guess, popular in France at the time. So they show women from the quote unquote Orient, North Africa, different places which the women were either of Asian, Middle Eastern, or African descent, and they are usually nude. So the one piece that the photograph is associated with the sculpture, I believe the title of the photograph is maybe, the English translation would be like two Tunisian women.
I think two Tuareg women, maybe.
Two Tuareg women.
Yeah.
Matisse' work is called Two Negresses, which I understand has like one maybe translation in French. It has one translation in English. It has different connotations. And then thinking about the time in which it would have been titled that versus now, it's the connotation of the word and the term has gone through so many different evolutions. So I was mostly drawn to the piece because of the titling of it. And that's kind of why that's the piece I kind of zoned in on. And this is my first kind of interpretation of it, in which I had the two figures facing forward and staring out at the viewer. And again, they have this aspect of a second self that's related through shadowing. And I'm just, at this point, I'm really just playing around with what already exists in the work in a very matter-of-fact way. In this work and also in Two Women Too. I can't say that I'm adding any huge intervention conceptually, but just kind of seeing like what's possible with the parts that already exist. So that's kind of the idea behind this one piece.
Shada, I'm curious, I haven't actually seen these in person. Can you tell us how large these images are, these paintings are, so we can get a sense of scale?
So this work is, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it's 7 feet tall by 6 feet wide, or it might be 8 feet tall by 7 feet wide. Those are the approximate dimensions. So they're large. The women are larger than life. They're quite. The painting itself is large, and the women are larger than any woman would be in actuality, which differs quite a lot from the sculpture. And would also differ quite a lot from the inspiration from the sculpture, which would have been just a little black and white photograph and just daily magazine kind of thing. So the scale, I think, definitely does a lot to try to change the connotation of the women. I think that they seem much more, I don't want to use powerful, but just the magnitude, how much space that they're taking up, I think lends kind of puts the viewer in a different perspective. Relationship to,
I certainly feel like it changes in a way, like that kind of the power dynamic too of the viewer and who's being viewed, right? And it makes me think a little bit about this idea of, we talk a lot about the male gaze when we talk about Western art history, and sort of a feminist perspective on that is that, we think about this idea of gaze direction, which is really meant to decenter the notion of the cis white male gaze and sort of restructure our thinking about it. And I'm wondering for you, what sort of relationship gaze has to it with the figures in this work, and also with the spectators of this work.
The gaze that I think the gaze that my work has is truly, if I'm being sincere, is my gaze, because like I'm the maker of the work, and I never try to put myself in the head space of like another kind of person with a different, like, I guess, lived experience, because I think for one, it's not truly possible for me to understand what their perspective would be, but also I don't find it productive in any kind of way for myself. So the gaze that exists in the work is mine, and I identify as female, I identify as Black, so I suppose it would be a Black woman's gaze. That's how I look at my figures, and maybe naively, that's how I assume they will be viewed once they're out in the world. But I am aware of the what would come with other kinds of perspectives. So, but I feel like if I think about that too much in the making of the work, it's going to change my ultimate goal. It becomes somewhat counterproductive in some way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting in thinking about what you kind of said about the shifts in scale as related to shift in experience. Because when you mentioned the photograph of the two young women that inspired Matisse, or that Matisse saw, that would have been in something that a person could hold. It was something that, you know, they could have carried around, they could have put it on a table. There's a level of there's a physical relationship that's completely different from walking into a gallery and having this larger than life painting kind of just there, more in the space than you are as a person. And so, you know, it's interesting to think about how these paintings are almost, for as much as they are made of materials that could be used in domestic spaces or that could be consumed in other areas, like they're almost beyond consumption in a way. Whereas like something like the, I don't know, the pseudo-anthropological magazine was very much an artifact that was meant for consumption.
That's true. I mean, I feel like art, because it's people experience it in so many different ways. I'm sure people will see this and it might just be an image on their phone. So, I mean, it really is how people interact with the piece. But I do agree with you that if someone was to go see this in person, it would be a much different experience than if they were to see a reproduction of it or to kind of engage with it more passively. And again, if someone was to experience or meet the two women depicted in the original photograph in real life, that would be a much different experience than to see them kind of framed within this gaze and that's just circulated around for passive consumption once again.
I'm curious if we can talk a little bit more about the figures as individuals and in relation to one another. And I know you've talked about sort of the inspirations or the sort of source material that you're sort of pulling from, but I'm curious from your perspective, are your figures, do they tend to be individuals? Are they metaphors largely? Are they meant to be universal? You talked a little bit about creating from your perspective and from your gaze, but I'm wondering about sort of these individual women that you're depicting and sort of how you see them.
In each work, it's a little bit different. In some works, I feel like the figures are more icons, so they don't necessarily have they don't have an individual identity. They might not have any identity. They're actually just meant to be a kind of accumulation of different thoughts and ideas, and they're truly meant to be vessels for others to like project into, and maybe even sometimes I think they're meant to function as mirrors, so you can look into it and maybe see it's not a reflection of yourself. There are other works in which the entire work is far more narrative. So I'm really thinking about character building, thinking about the figures and the pieces as even being like protagonists, like they're almost like they're participating in a play or something like that. And then there are other works in which I think that I'm, creating this one persona, an individual that has a backstory that's, you're encountering in their present, and that there's a potentiality for them to have something beyond this moment, the moment being the painting itself and the future. So it really varies from work to work, and each work has a different mood, and each work has, I had a different intention in making each individual work. So if you were to look at all the different paintings in the show, you'll see a little bit of all of that from the various works.
That's great. Thank you.
And I guess with that, I'd love to see kind of how you played with two women across the other paintings. And if we could maybe see two women, number 2, that would be great. I also want to share that this is the first time that you are showing these paintings. Or at least within the Baltimore Museum of Art. So we're really excited to be able to have that opportunity. So I'd be curious to hear a little more about how you moved from kind of the first painting to the second, and what were the things that you changed in your thinking and approach between the two, and sort of like the questions that you were hoping to explore.
Mhm. So this is Two Women Too. This work is more than one-to-one, me trying to recreate the actual composition of the sculpture, which was more difficult than I had anticipated because the sculpture is an object that exists in 3 dimensions, and I was trying to, again, flatten it for 2. So in this work, I was thinking too about building a distinct identities for each figure, and kind of thinking more about what's the potential dynamic between the two. Reading about the photograph and the sculpture itself, they said that the figure who was, if you see most reproductions of the sculpture, is a figure that's facing you. That figure is slightly more slender and is believed to be, in the Matisse sculpture, a stand-in for like a male persona. So if it was a man that was meant to be looking at the sculpture, or in the original photograph, they're saying that that figure was meant to have more of like a masculine energy, and that was meant to be the figure or the person that the male in this male gaze, I guess, situation would have identified with. So I was kind of playing a little bit with that kind of gender, association in this painting, thinking about how that can be rendered, thinking about the yellow orange figure as possibly being the dominant figure within the dynamic, and seeing how far I can push that within the work. Also to adding more detail and building in the two figures, so just on a formally really constructing them, and making them feel as 2-dimensional as possible, despite the reality of them being flat.
And since we are in like the extra flat medium of a digital broadcast, I'd love it if you could share more about what it means to construct the figure, since you are playing with so many materials. And here we've got a detail of those two figures in relation to each other.
Yeah, so constructing the figures really means just building them bit by bit with various materials. So the materials that I'm primarily using are textiles. When I refer to textiles in my work, most of the time it's actually canvas itself, which people often forget is a textile. That is either dyed or hand painted. I'm also working with fabrics. In this particular painting, there's a lot of tulle. I really enjoyed working with the tulle because it has a transparency. It also has, when placed onto a more consistent piece of material, it creates these little striations, which I think really mimic kind of dimples and folds in a woman's body. It's really fun to play with in this particular piece.
And so are we seeing that you sort of painted through tulle on the face? And sort of, it almost seems like there's a little bit of a positive negative relationship there in getting that pattern.
Yeah, so some parts of the material are painted, and once they're painted, they're layered and sewn, and sometimes they're pulled apart and sewn back together. It's a multi-layer process, and when I look back at it, sometimes once it's all complete, I myself would have to look at it very closely to remember all the little details and steps. But it's, for people who are not familiar with the work or haven't seen the work before in person, I'm building materials one on top of the other, very similarly to how someone would, as you mentioned earlier, in filmmaking, or if you've ever seen any kind of like applique process in fashion or in design, it's very similar. So if you think about collage, it's the same idea, but instead of using truly flat pieces of paper, I'm using, fabrics that have more depth and pile to them.
Yeah, thank you for kind of bringing a little bit more of that tactility to life, since I think it's hard to gauge just from these images. And I'd love to talk about Two Women 3 as well, since we're getting to preview the paintings. So we'll just Oh, and we actually have a question from Anna Dare, who asks, are these hand sewn or machine sewn?
They're machine sewn, yeah.
Okay. Great.
So this work is 2 Women 3, and for this take on the subject, I really wanted to do something that was very different. I wanted to bring the women into a contemporary space, and I also wanted to pull them out of the art historical references that I was first kind of toying with in the first 2 iterations of the piece, and kind of bring them into a space I felt it was a safe space, a domestic space, and a space in which they had a very clear and private relationship to one another. A relationship I think in some ways is even more ambiguous than the ambiguous relationship from the other 2 works.
Where are you seeing, I'm sort of curious, like I see a lot of affection in this painting. You know, it could be the moment of somebody saying a really warm hello, somebody sharing like a funny joke or a secret. But there's a real intimacy, and you talked about kind of the safety of the domesticity as well. And so I'm curious, like where are you playing with the ambiguity of that relationship?
Well, for me, I feel like they're sharing a secret amongst each other. So I feel like the ambiguity exists in the unknown of their secret. So what they're speaking about, kind of how that is something that is unknown and will continue to be, because for me, it feels almost like a cliffhanger of sorts. And also the fact that they're both are moving, or they're not static in the moment, that too, I think adds a lot of tension to the painting. And I feel like it could be any number of dynamics between them. Maybe they're family members, maybe they're friends. But it could really go in any one direction. For me, I tried to describe this domestic space with a motif that I've used in other works. It's actually borrowed mostly from like Horace Pippin, thinking about this like hardwood floor, actually, that I kind of used to delineate this domestic space. And also having the chair and the primary figure in the work sitting on the chair.
I was just going to actually ask about sort of the treatment of the floor, and I love how just a few subtle sort of props gives us a real sense of placement, right? But I'm curious about how you've created that sort of pattern on the floor. And then a question from one of our viewers, they're wondering about your color palette and how they said they really love your use of color and how you develop your color palette for your work.
A lot of it is, again, experimentation. I think that I'm like willing to take some risk in color and do things which maybe wouldn't normally make sense. Like, for example, the shadow behind them is lighter almost than they are in the foreground, but I think that it really allowed for the entire work to become like illuminated. Having worked a lot in the past in printmaking and really missing that kind of illumination that comes through from like a white piece of paper behind a graphic image printed on top, I think I wanted to borrow some of that for this particular painting.
Yeah, I think I love that comparison. Because the first thing that I saw when I saw that green shadow was that it felt like a ghost print. So the thing where an image has been, and just sort of seeing that trace printing on a piece of paper, which I think, you know, given that you're often pulling in materials that have their own memories, that have their own histories, like the idea of being able to sort of trace material and where it's been is really beautiful. And yeah, the idea of this being like an illuminated painting is also, I think, really, really lovely. And I'm just loving the painting right now. Like, this is not even, but I do think it's really beautiful that here the focus on the kind of the tenderness and the proximity of the figures is so clear, because for as close physically as the women are in 2 Women by Matisse, you don't have the same sense of like, or at least I don't have the same sense of a shared emotional space or a shared understanding that is for them and made by them. Like it feels very posed. Whereas this painting, it feels so emotionally familiar to me.
Yeah, so I would say, the third time after trial and error, I finally was able to create an answer to the Matisse painting as opposed to making works that were inspired by. So even for me, it was truly an evolution through kind of unpacking the work and making my own responses. And it honestly was a challenge as well. But to have landed on this last work, I could say more confidently that I arrived at a place when I had an answer to the work.
Well, I appreciate you. I feel like I'm hearing my math teachers from days past, like, show your work. And I just want to say thank you for showing your work, because each of these pieces really illuminates, and I think it makes us appreciate the next one even more. So Shaba, thank you for sharing your work and for showing your work.
Yeah.
And that actually ties in perfectly with a question that we have from a viewer asking if you do sketches beforehand. And to ask if you can elaborate on how you work out your compositions. And I think we do have an image of a sketch that you did. Here we go, with the little label, Two Girls.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between this drawing and kind of the question and your response to Matisse?
So I do sketches before works occasionally, but I also do a lot of sketching with the various pieces that comprise the finished work. Because another part of my practice, which probably isn't evident from looking at the final piece, is that all those different parts that build up the figure or the composition, they are kind of loose and modular up until maybe some of the last moments of the work, when they all become sewn down with the sewing machine onto like a more consistent piece of canvas that's then stretched. So I'm also sketching quite a bit with the different pieces that make the work. And again, bringing something like an idea like this and from the sketch into the more dimensional paintings, sometimes it's a one-to-one thing, but sometimes it's not as simple, So the sketch, they give me somewhat of an idea of what I'm getting into, but oftentimes I really don't know how challenging each individual work would be or how to kind of sort out some of the compositional issues until I have all the various pieces that will eventually create the final work.
Yeah, I'm sort of imagining when you talk about the modular pieces, like shifting things around on the canvas and really kind of having the figures in motion until the moment when you decide to fix them by sewing them into place. Is that accurate, or is this just like my Yeah,
that's right. For sure.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's almost like you've got a dance party in your studio.
Shaba, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about your work in 3-dimension. You were talking about how Matisse, sort of that sculpture, was in part inspiration for this series, and now you're going from 2-dimension to 3-dimension. I was wondering if you could tell everyone a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm experimenting more and more with sculpture. It's a way for me to create more dynamic exhibition spaces so that I feel like the viewer's entering into a more immersive space. So instead of them just having this relationship to works on the wall, I want them to physically have to negotiate kind of walking around works that exist in the same place that they do. That was the original idea, and kind of exploring sculpture, but also the sculpture is a challenge for me, and it allows me to kind of become more ambitious and with my paintings, and because the things that I have to problem solve in sculpture is to make them successful, even to allow them to stand, which is like the most difficult but also the most important thing about a sculpture. I'm able to bring that knowledge back into my paintings, my drawings, and all my wall work. So I enjoy it. It kind of keeps everything vibrant and interesting within my studio as well.
Yeah, and just for context, the image that we had just before is of a work in progress. Like, that's not the finished piece, but it will be part of, and here's the reverse so that you can see kind of the way that you've used, I think you said it was leggings.
So I've used I use a lot of materials in the armatures of the sculptures that I normally would use in the paintings themselves. So I did use latings here and also polyfill, which are all works I use to my paintings as well.
And so I love how even though the finished sculpture that will be on view at the BMA is going to be made out of bronze, there's still fabric. There's still kind of that textile core that has been part of the process along the way. So, Chaba, I do want to thank you so much for spending time with us today, and ask if there are any sort of final thoughts or questions that you want to explore together as we round out our lunch hour.
Oh, I just want to thank you for having me, and I'm excited to share the show with audiences in Baltimore, and kind of excited to see what people's take will be on the exhibition.
It's really awesome. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, it opens on the 28th of March. Is that right? Awesome.
Yes, 28th
well, thank
of March.
you again for being with us. And for our viewers, thank you for joining us and contributing questions and comments. Next month, we're going to be back on April 13th at 12 noon Eastern. And our topic will be Counter Story. We'll explore the works of Filipino-American conceptual artist Stephanie Sajuco and textile and social practice artist Sonia Clark. So I hope you will join us then. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care.